Welcome to this presentation, this class on the polity of the Episcopal Church and how it is structured. If you have found this and you are hoping to be confirmed through Trinity Episcopal Church in Bloomington, Indiana, congratulations. This is one of the required courses in order to be confirmed. If you've just found this, you're welcome to watch it as well. I'm the Reverend Matt Seddon, and I am currently the rector of Trinity Episcopal Church. I'm an Episcopal priest, and this is part of our series to help people learn, anyone who wants to learn more about the Episcopal Church, and it is also part of preparation for being confirmed or received into the Episcopal Church. And this is a course on Episcopal Church polity and structure, as the slide says. And the goal is to give you a sense of how we are organized as a church, how authority is structured in the church, earthly authority. Jesus is the head of the church, but Jesus usually isn't around to answer detailed questions about bylaws. And so how do we organize earthly authority? These are important questions for any church, but they are particularly important in the Episcopal Church because they are part and parcel of our identity. And they also give us some of our distinctiveness, some of the ways that we are a church that incorporates some aspects of the ancient church, or the church now known as Roman Catholicism, as well as aspects of Protestant organization. We are kind of in the middle. We are neither a congregational church nor an incredibly hierarchical church. And that shapes our common life together and how we do things, and is important for anyone to know. So to get into it, the first question I will ask and hope that you will be able to answer at the end of this presentation is, who owns our church? So this is a picture of Trinity Episcopal in Bloomington. Who owns it? Or to be more specific, who could sell it? Could we sell all or part of it? I mean, that's a crucial thing in terms of church ownership. Who could actually sell it, all of it or part of it? Could I do it, Rev Matt? Could any other committee at Trinity do it? Could the diocese sell it? Oh, wait, I don't know what a diocese is. Well, don't worry, we'll get into that. Could the presiding bishop do it? You have a presiding bishop? What does that mean? Could the Archbishop of Canterbury do it? Is that person a pope-like kind of person? And can they sell your church? Anyway, I'm not going to answer the question now, but sort of pay attention through this presentation, and I hope that you can answer it by the end. Another way to kick this off is to talk about two major forms of churches in the Episcopal Church, or communities of worship, or church communities. We use the terms parish and mission, and those are two very important distinguishing terms. And I have two pictures of Episcopal churches here, and I'll give you a second or two to think about which one is a parish and which one is a mission. 1 second, 2 seconds. Could you figure it out? Well, if you couldn't, that's good, because both of them are parishes. It has nothing to do with how the church looks, whether it's modern or more traditional. I'll show you the differences. A parish is financially self-supporting. Basically, all the money that the parish needs for it to run comes from their own members in the form of pledges or from any kind of outside income. Parishes do have more control over their church property, but I'll be getting into that. They don't have total control over it. A parish is led by a priest who is called a rector, and that's just a term used in the U.S. In England, all priests in the Church of England in charge of churches are called vicars. But in the U.S., if you're in charge of a parish, a financially self-supporting church, you're called a rector. And a parish, has the right to hire their own rector with minimal oversight from the bishop. And finally, a parish has bylaws that govern how it's operated. A mission, on the other hand, is a church that is not fully self-supporting. They get some money from pledges and maybe outside income, but they get some of their money from the diocese. In some cases, all of the money they need comes from the diocese. This goes along with they have less control over their property. The diocese completely controls their property. They have what's called a vicar in this church. So the priest in charge of a mission is called a vicar. because in essence, the official rector of a mission is the bishop of the diocese. The term vicar means somebody who is standing in on a day-to-day basis for the bishop. And with a mission, a bishop can just appoint or remove a vicar. The mission people don't have any say in that whatsoever. But missions also have bylaws, so that isn't a difference between the two. It really has to do with whether they're self-supporting financially and the amount of control that the bishop has over them. Trinity Episcopal here in Bloomington has been a parish since 1942. So it was founded in 1871. For a long period of its history, it was a mission, meaning it got some of its money from the diocese. But since we are now a parish, we have a rector, that's me. I'm responsible for making sure we abide by canons and policies. I am responsible for making sure worship happens. I'm responsible for spirituality and pastoral care. I'm responsible for day-to-day operations. I should have put on here, I am responsible for teaching, baptizing, marrying, burying people, hatch, match, and dispatch, as we call it. And I pretty much have control over everything that happens on the property or in the buildings. On the other hand, we have a vestry, which I'll talk about a little bit more. They are elected lay leadership. They are responsible for the budget, for example. I, as rector, cannot spend money on anything that I want. Only the vestry can. They are responsible for the building, so I can't knock something down. I can't even fix the roof without talking to the vestry. I mean, if I tell them it needs to be fixed, they're going to agree with me very quickly. But, I mean, I can't just knock a building down, build a new one, change a window, whatever. Vestry also advises the rector on many important decisions. Now, more about vestries. The vestry here at Trinity, because each vestry is slightly different, but really only in their size or maybe some of the details. Our vestry, like others, is elected at a parish annual meeting, a meeting of the entire parish that happens in January of each year. The vestry here has 9 members. Some vestries have 12, some vestries have 7. They frequently serve, well, ours and most other vestries, an elected vestry member serves a 3-year term, and 3 are elected every year. So there's turnover every year, but also 6 of the people on the vestry have been around and have some institutional memory, at least of 3 years, some of them of 6 years. A nominating committee is who nominates the people for vestry, and then they are voted on and elected by the entire parish. So it is kind of like electing members of Congress. We are a representative democracy. The whole parish does not vote on every issue. The vestry does. Now, from the vestry here at Trinity, I get to select a rector's warden, who is somebody who is one of my main counselors, and who is somebody who is understood to be helping me represent my interests, which also I develop in consultation with them and the vestry. And a people's warden who's elected by the vestry, another senior counselor whose main role is to make sure that I am hearing clearly the desires of the people and the vestry. Vestries also have a clerk who records and takes minutes. And all parishes have a treasurer, someone who is in charge of the money on a day-to-day basis, reporting on our income and expenditures to the vestry and advising the vestry about whether we have money to buy something, whether we need to be more careful. So that's how Trinity's basic leadership is set up. Now we happen to have a deacon here as well. Her role is primarily in certain aspects of worship and reaching out to the community. However, I also consider my deacon to be a senior counselor and assistant. Here at Trinity, let's talk about money. Money is always very important. Follow the money. And this is going to vary by church. Some churches have more money, some have less. But I'll just use Trinity as an example. We have an annual budget of about $350,000. That's the total amount we take in through pledges and other income. Income for us is almost entirely what's called pledge and plate. People pledge every year to give money, just like people do to PBS or NPR. And then they send in money once a year or monthly or weekly or whatever. And then what we call plate, that's the amount of money that's collected every Sunday when people put money in the offering plate. In the old days, the offering plate was mainly how money arrived at the church. Now it's really not as important. People send checks, or we even have the ability for people to pay online and even set up automatic payments and deductions from your bank account, which I highly recommend. Now, we have a little bit of outside income from various rental, but income can come from other places. Some parishes have actual investments, stocks, or I served a parish once that had royalties from an oil well that came to them. Some parishes own property that they rent out or can sell, or they rent some of their space, or they have a school established with them that not only covers its expenses but makes a profit. We happen to have an endowment. Not all parishes have this, so Trinity's lucky to have it. Right now, our endowment is approximately $1.5 million. But this is not money just sitting around for us to use willy-nilly, however we want. There are restrictions. It can only be used to overcome unexpected expenses, and even when it does, and when we use it for that, we have to have a plan and pay it back. So we can't just take money out of it for whatever we want and not put it back in. So it's there as an emergency fund that has to be carefully protected. We also have restricted funds, like people have donated money to be used to pay every year for someone to sing in the choir or to maintain some important aspect of the building, things like that. But we're very fortunate to have an endowment. It does give us a certain cushion in the case of emergencies. Here we have a staff, paid staff members. That would include me, our administrator, our sexton, which is a fancy word for the building manager, our music director, she's part-time, our faith formation director for children and teenagers, who is also part-time. We have a deacon who we consider on staff too, but she actually is a volunteer, which is typical for most churches, although deacons sometimes are paid at churches. And just to tell you, the way we do it is not the only way it's done. I have served smaller churches where the staffing was me and a part-time secretary. But other churches are larger. They might have multiple priests. They might have a rector and 5 assistant priests, each of whom does slightly different things, and then maybe many deacons or many full-time staffers. The head of a Sunday school full-time, or the music director might be full-time, and you might even have an organist who's full-time. So it really depends on how large your parish is or your mission is and how much money you have to play with. Now, aside from staff, we do most of our work through our ministries, which are how we describe regular, consistent ways we try to carry out God's desires for us to help in the process of healing the world and making the reign of God come to fruition. And accepting our music and our faith formation children's ministries, they are all volunteer-led. At Trinity, we call them commissions. Other places call them committees or teams. We have one called Compassion, Peace, and Reconciliation, or CPR, that works on justice. Outreach works on what I call mercy work, where if someone's hungry, we feed them, where we donate money to food banks, where we donate food to food banks, where we help with homeless issues, things like that. We have a commission that just helps manage the buildings and the grounds, because our building and grounds are very old and really need constant attention. We have a finance commission to make sure we're careful with our money. We have another commission to manage that endowment, make sure we're careful with that. We have a faith formation commission to help Emily, our faith formation leader, in developing and carrying out teaching and classes. We have small groups that are run by various folks. We have a pastoral care commission helping people who need help at home or are sad or need visits. And we have a commission that produces education for adults in our forum, things like that. Other ministries that we have are associated with more national types of ministries. Daughters of the King is a group of Episcopal women, national organization that is together for spiritual nourishment and learning. EFM is Education for Ministry, which is a formal program of learning about the Bible, theology, and church history. Very good program. We have an EFM group. We have an altar guild. They take care of all of the things we need for worship: candles, chalices, wine, bread. Make sure all of that is there and set up for each service. Our acolytes, the cross and the candles and torches. We have something called GPS, Good Parenting Support, a group that helps out young parents. We have a team that is helping us celebrate our 150th anniversary, things like that. Some of these groups have their own budgets that is within the total budget of the vestry of the parish, and when it's their budget, it's under their control with just some oversight from the vestry. So we divvy up things and spread out who can spend money, things like that. And again, I myself cannot spend any money. I don't have my own budget at all. I have to ask for money if I need it. Now, every mission or parish in the Episcopal Church is part of a diocese. So dioceses are larger groupings within the Episcopal Church that have a geographical boundary. There are 111 dioceses in the USA, and we even have dioceses in foreign countries. Generally, each diocese in the US is an entire state. However, where the state's population and number of Episcopalians is very large, there might be multiple dioceses in one state. Texas has 5 dioceses. Virginia has 3 dioceses. Indiana has 2. We are the Diocese of Indianapolis, which is sort of from a little north of Indianapolis all the way down to the Ohio River. And we have about 50 parishes or missions in this diocese. Each parish or non-missionary, is independent, etc. And there are missionary and non-missionary dioceses. So we are an independent diocese. We are financially independent. If you're a missionary diocese, you need money from the national church. Each diocese has its own set of rules and laws, bylaws, which are called canons, which is just a fancy name for church laws. And you can have your own canons, but the canons of the broader church, the laws of the entire Episcopal Church, always take precedence. It's sort of like state laws versus federal laws. And each diocese has its own bishop and is able to pick its own bishop, and I'll talk a little bit about how that happens. But every bishop is ratified and agreed to by all the other dioceses in the USA. So dioceses do get their own choice in bishops as long as the rest of the country agrees with them, which everybody almost always does. So our bishop, and bishops in general, by implication, our bishop is the Right Reverend Jennifer Baskerville-Burroughs. Right Reverend is a way you refer to bishops. I am just a reverend. She is the 11th bishop of this diocese. And here's the key thing. Our bishops are elected at a convention of the diocese by elected representatives from each parish or mission. All the clergy persons and elected laity persons go to this convention. So again, we choose our leaders by representative democracy. In a certain other large hierarchical church, which I won't name, the hierarchy chooses who's a bishop. The people don't get any choice whatsoever. We get our choice in the Episcopal Church. This makes us a little weird in terms of being Protestants. A lot of other Protestant churches, everybody votes on everything. We instead vote on representatives who then vote on key issues. And we have preserved a hierarchy in the sense that the bishop is the chief priest and pastor. I promise to obey the bishop, so she has pretty direct control over me as long as she doesn't violate the canons with any of her orders. And she also, but at the same time, we have a lot of independence. So there's a hierarchy, but there's also some freedom. The bishops ordain deacons and priests. Only a bishop can do that. Bishops confirm and receive people into the Episcopal Church. The diocese has a budget, and just like a priest doesn't control the budget of their parish, she doesn't control the diocesan budget. The Diocesan Council, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, does, and they're elected, like a vestry. And also the bishop represents us in gatherings of the wider church, which are things like the House of Bishops, the meeting of all the presiding bishops called the primates meeting or the Lambeth Conference, which takes place every 10 years or so in England. How are dioceses organized? Well, dioceses always have some staff. It depends on how big and how rich the diocese is. Here we have a canon to the ordinary, which is a sort of chief staff for congregational development and leadership. Canon to the ordinary. Ordinary just means main bishop. We only have one bishop, so it doesn't matter, but some dioceses have a bishop and an assistant or two assistants, and the main bishop is called the ordinary. So we have one for administration and evangelism. We have a chancellor who is in charge of making sure we do everything legally and correctly. We have a treasurer, who's like the treasurer of a parish or any organization. We have a transition officer who helps parishes find priests when their priest retires. They have administrative assistants and some staffers who reach out to particular communities, and they're called missioners. Then there are several elected groups, elected clergy and laity on the Executive Council. The Executive Council manages the budget and finances and also helps direct the opportunities, vision, mission, and diocesan-wide ministries. There is a standing committee, again, elected. I am a member of the standing committee here in Indianapolis, as it turns out. And the standing committee is in charge of selling things, of watching over any debt that the diocese has or approving taking on debt if they do, can act as a bishop if the bishop is not there, oversees bishop elections. And I told you that when a bishop's elected, everybody else has to agree to it. Well, it's the standing committee of each diocese that does that agreement. So again, there is a lot of elected representation of people, clergy and laity, in the management of our church, which does not happen in large, very hierarchical churches. And in congregational churches, every decision goes to a vote of everybody. So we're kind of in between hierarchical and democratic, fully like one person, one vote democratic. The diocese also has a commission on ministry. They decide who can be accepted to be ordained as a priest or a deacon, and also has a group in charge of Title IV, which is a section of the canons that are disciplinary for priests, and that has several different types of officers. So that's how the diocese is organized. Now, the interesting thing is, just like a parish every year has an annual meeting, every year a diocese has a convention, and this meets once a year. Each parish or mission elects a number of delegates based on their size, plus the wardens and clergy automatically go. So here's the cool thing. If you grow and you're a big parish, you get more power at the Diocesan Convention. It's an incentive for parishes to grow. The Diocesan Convention reviews the diocese budget, although the Executive Committee is the one that passes it. And the convention passes legislation, any changes to canons, laws, policies, or direction of where we might want to spend special money or things we want to require parishes to do. And the Diocesan Convention also elects people for things like the Executive Committee I told you about, or the Council, or Disciplinary Court, or delegates to General Convention. And I will be getting that to what General Convention is in a second, because we are now talking about the Episcopal Church. So all the dioceses make up the entire Episcopal Church, which again, now we're no longer surprised, has a big formal set of its own bylaws called the Constitution and Canons of the Episcopal Church. And let's go through how the Episcopal Church is organized. The Episcopal Church does have a presiding bishop. So each diocese has anywhere from one to several bishops, and then they all elect, they're called the House of Bishops, and they elect a presiding bishop. He or she is called a primate. However, they are not a pope. They serve not for life, but a single 9-year term. They do not speak for the entire church. They do have a lot of influence, and they control certain appointments and things like that, but they are not like a pope. They are more called a primus inter pares, or a first among equals. And the current presiding bishop is the Most Reverend Michael Curry. So I get to be called the Reverend because I'm a priest. The bishop gets to be called the Right Reverend because she's a bishop. And the presiding bishop gets to be called the Most Reverend. There will be a quiz. No, there won't. I'm joking. Okay, so if the presiding bishop can't speak for the whole church, who can? That's the General Convention of the Episcopal Church. And it's an elected body, surprise. And it's the only body that speaks for the entire church. The only thing that can make proclamations, change canons, change procedures, change things. Only the General Convention, not the presiding bishop, not all the bishops. It is the only official voice of the church. You see a picture there of one of the meetings of General Convention. They meet every 3 years, so it's a big deal, and it doesn't happen all the time. It is composed of the House of Deputies, which is half clergy and half lay people, so half priests and or deacons and half lay people. And each diocese elects the clergy and lay people they're going to send. They send 3 clergy and 3 lay people, no matter how big each diocese is. And then there's a House of Bishops, which, as you might imagine, is all the bishops. Legislation or changes to canons have to pass both houses. This sounds a lot like the House of Representatives and the Senate, and it is because the people who set this up when our church was formed in 1789 were people like George Washington. So you can see how they brought this kind of representative democracy that they were implementing in the nation into our church. So the General Convention, as I've been mentioning, makes changes to laws and canons, which can be anything from how you discipline priests to how you ordain priests to what rules govern who can get married. Can someone who's divorced get married? The answer is yes, but the canons specify a few additional things that have to be done to prepare a divorced person to be married, things like that. The General Convention, the Episcopal Church, has a budget. Each diocese sends a certain amount of money to the Episcopal Church to help the church as a whole operate. And the amount of money is a percentage of their total operating budget. I think it's supposed to be 19% of all the money they take in is supposed to go to the national church. And the General Convention can issue statements from the official statements of the church and is the only body that can change the Book of Common Prayer, or BCP, which is what guides our worship. So they have an important role. And again, people are elected. So lay people have authority and rights and voice and vote in all levels of the Episcopal Church, from the smallest mission to the General Convention or the entire church. That's quite cool. So we are somewhere in between a completely hierarchical church and one that's completely congregational, or where everybody has to vote on every decision. So that, I think, makes us very interesting. And sometimes people who come from congregational churches are surprised that they don't have as much vote as they thought they might, that they have to either be elected to a position or vote for somebody or vote at their parish level for something that's only applicable to the parish. And they might find us weird, but also people who come to us from a certain large church, Roman in the world, often find us weird too, because the priests and bishops don't simply decide everything. There are actual elected groups that decide things. Now, the Episcopal Church doesn't sit, in fact, off all by itself. It is part of a broader organization called the Anglican Communion. And all of the countries in here that have colors are have churches that are part of the Anglican Communion. And you can actually, if you think carefully, with the exception of Mexico, Central and South America, and certain parts of Asia, most of this is in areas where the Church of England established colonies. The US, Canada, Africa, these are places where the Church of England spread out from England when they were missionizing the world, and basically Church of England throughout the world. Since then, other places have joined our church, our broader church. So there's an Anglican church in Mexico. There's an Anglican church in Brazil, even though they didn't arise out of colonization. The church in England, the Anglican church in India, independently formed and then requested to be a part of the Anglican Communion. The interesting thing is each of these places is called a province. So the U.S. is a province, the Episcopal Church is a province, Anglican Church of Mexico is a province, and each one is independent. So, for example, there is an Archbishop of Canterbury. He is the Bishop of Canterbury Cathedral. He is technically the Archbishop of the entire Anglican Communion, but he is not a pope. He's, again, a first among equals. He cannot dictate anything to any province other than his own, which is England. Right now, that Archbishop is the Most Reverend Justin Welby. Now, the Archbishop of Canterbury is highly respected. We listen to him. I read his sermons. I read his pastoral letters and things like that. He does have a number of specific powers that make him very influential. But again, he cannot tell the Episcopal Church what to do. He can harangue us, he can lean on us, he can embarrass us, but he can't tell us what to do. And, this is a way that we connect with each other. In fact, we tend to say that instead of having formal, hierarchical, legal rules that define how the Church of England or any one church is over or under any other church, we are called a communion, the Anglican Communion, and a communion of churches, and we have what we call instruments of communion, which is really the formal ways in which we connect to our Anglican brothers and sisters in Africa, in India, in Mexico, and the way we make sure we all hang together around the world. One is basically the Archbishop of Canterbury, or what's called the See of Canterbury, which is an old term for what people who talk to that bishop. And so the Archbishop of Canterbury, even though he, and it's a he right now, isn't in charge, is one of the ways we recognize that we have commonality. The Archbishop invites every bishop. So Archbishop is sometimes called the ABC, Archbishop of Canterbury. The Archbishop invites every bishop in the entire Anglican Communion to come to Lambeth Palace in England, which is where the Archbishop, the ABC, lives, and comes to a conference. This happens every 10 years, but it's very cool. I mean, it's like 600 bishops, and they do get to meet each other and share problems and solutions and pray and do things together. So that is one way that we all connect with each other. There is also, you might be surprised to find out, yet another council of folks, and guess what? They're elected, lay and ordained. So the national churches or provinces elect representatives to the Anglican Consultative Council. And then there's something called a primates meeting, which sounds kind of funny if you know of primates as like chimps, chimpanzees, and gorillas and orangutans. But what it really means is the presiding bishops or primates of each province, like our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, they meet every single year. So all the presiding bishops from around the world meet every year to share things, to pray together, to work out conflicts or challenges, things like that, to work together on common mission projects, things like that. So just to sum it all up, we are a parish of the Episcopal Church that is part of the Diocese of Indianapolis of the Episcopal Church. The Episcopal Church itself is part of the Anglican Communion. So that's how it is organized. And just in case you're curious, here are some famous Anglicans from around the world. So that's the former Archbishop Desmond Tutu. May he rest in peace. You may have heard of him for his peace efforts and reconciliation efforts in South Africa after apartheid, bringing apartheid to an end and healing the country afterwards. He is a wonderful theologian and peacemaker, or was. He is gone on to his glory with God, and he's one of us. He's an Anglican. Here is somebody you might not recognize by his face, or maybe even the name as I put it now, Clive Stapleton Lewis, or C.S. Lewis, the guy who wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, as well as a bunch of other great Christian theological works like the Screwtape Letters or Mere Christianity. He was a professor in England. He was not a priest, and he was Anglican. And guess what? Mork. Of Mork and Mindy, if anybody remembers that show from the 70s, and if you don't, you might recognize the actor, and that's who I'm actually talking about. The actor Robin Williams was an Episcopalian. So Another cool Episcopalian is Garrison Keillor, if you listen to NPR and you like, or he used to do Lake Wobegon days. So there's Anglicans all over the place, and you probably already knew them and didn't recognize it. Now, so we return to our question. Who could sell our church? Think about it for a second. Well, we now know that it's not me. I have no control over the building or budget. I cannot sell the church. Guess what, though? It's not the vestry. Now, they have responsibility for the buildings and grounds. They can modify the buildings or the grounds. They have a responsibility to keep them in good condition, but even the vestry cannot sell our church. The individual buildings are actually owned at the level of the diocese. So every church in the Episcopal Church, every parish, every mission, the buildings and grounds are owned by the diocese. So we here at Trinity couldn't vote to just sell the whole place. We would have to ask permission of the diocese. Now, if there was a good enough argument, they would let us do it. And dioceses do, from time to time, sell churches, use the money to build a new church somewhere else at the request of the parish. But the diocese is the one that actually controls the church. But here's the deal. Within these buildings that we manage and are responsible for, we get to do most everything else, okay? We control a lot of our fate. We have our own money. We decide how to spend it, aside from the amount that we have to send to the diocese. We get to pick our clergy, hire them. We get to hire our own staff. We get to decide what ministries we have. The bishop from time to time can make proclamations that things we should do or shouldn't do. During the height of the pandemic, it was the bishop who said things like you can't gather for worship. But for the most part, we get left alone to do our own stuff. We elect our own leaders, and we are much more democratic. And so essentially, we are a middle way in between very hierarchical churches where there is a single leader at the very top who picks other leaders, and it's a hierarchy, and the people at the bottom just send their money, and their money goes to the top, and maybe it comes back down, or maybe it doesn't. Or we're not like that. But we're also not like churches where every member of the congregation votes to hire their new pastor or fire their new pastor. And if they want to do something with the building, every member of the congregation does. Here in this church, at all levels, mission, parish, diocese, national church, and Anglican communion, we elect members, and not just clergy or bishops, but laity. So this is a church in which you have a voice, and it actually can be a pretty strong voice. Because here's the deal, I forgot to say this. At General Convention, anyone could show up, and anyone can speak at committee hearings, and anyone can ask their representative to read a letter on the floor. So, anyone can have voice in this church. So I hope that helps you understand the Episcopal Church better, understand what a parish is, and understand Trinity Episcopal Church. If you have any questions, please do contact me. Thank you all very much.